Okay, so now we're through the first part of the presentation where I was just giving you a bit of a background on the main concepts in Jungian theory. So hopefully as we move through this deeper into psychosis, you'll see the application of some of these things and it'll help you understand Jung's approach a bit more. So as we get into psychosis, I do want to mention some of Jung's early experiences that helped shape his thought process and approach because I think it is helpful and relevant to know these things. So early on, Jung worked at the Burgholzi Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, Switzerland. And at this hospital, he developed his early thoughts on complexes and the collective unconscious and archetypes. And one of the things he did that really influenced his thoughts on complexes was something called the word association test. And this is a test where you have someone hooked up to this machine who's reading their responses, sort of like the precursor of the lie detector test. And there's a list of 100 words, and you are noting their response to the words, how long they take to respond, and also what the words are that they associate with what they're reading. So you read them a word and they're supposed to tell you the first word that comes to their mind. So based on how people responded, such as how long they responded, Jung could tell if there was a complex constellated around a specific words. This was really influential on Jung's approach to understanding the importance of complexes. And Jung was also working with a lot of schizophrenic patients at this hospital. So I'm going to read this quote from Ellenberger that talks about one of the main experiences that Jung had that stood out to him and started to get him thinking about this layer of the psyche called the collective unconscious. So Jung says that one of the first experiences which led him to the idea of archetypes was the case of an old schizophrenic patient of the Burgholzi who abundantly hallucinated day and night. This patient once declared that he saw that the sun had a phallus whose movements produced the wind. The origin of the strange illusion seemed inexplicable until Jung's eyes fell on a recent book by a historian of religion, Dietrich, about the liturgy of the Mithric religion, such as revealed by a hitherto unpublished Greek papyrus. This text contained the mention of the wind originating in a tube hanging from the sun. The possibility that the patient had read that recently discovered text was ruled out. To Jung, the only explanation seemed to be that there are universal symbols which may appear in religious myths as well as psychotic delusions. So this is one of the early experiences Jung had when he started to think, there are symbolic material in the delusions and hallucinations of these schizophrenic patients, and you can find some of the same material in religious and mythological literature. So this really got him thinking that there must be a part of the psyche that produces these universal symbols, and this part of the psyche must be what people who are psychotic are engaging with or immersed in. So another early period in Jung's life and early work, which was influential, was whenever he was writing his dissertation, which was published around 1903 or 1902, and that was entitled The Psychology and Pathology of So-Called Occult Phenomena. So Jung was very interested early on in the parapsychological, the paranormal, and occult phenomena, and he wanted to study these things empirically, scientifically, and understand the psychology behind them. So whenever he was writing his dissertation, he was observing his young cousin who was a medium, and her name was Helen Prizework, and she would have mediumistic sessions that Jung would attend, where she would communicate with spirits and personify deceased members of her family and acquaintances, claiming that they were speaking through her. At times, her language would change, and she would speak perfect High German instead of her customary dialect. During later sessions, she began to say her name was Ivens, and her character was completely different from her regular personality. So here's a quote from Ellenberger talking about this time period. So Ivens said that she journeyed to the planet Mars, saw its canals and flying machines, and visited the inhabitants of the stars and spirit world. She was instructed by clear spirits, and she herself instructed black spirits. Other spirits could be classified into two groups. Some were rather dour and others exuberant. Jung noticed these characteristics corresponded with two aspects of the young medium's personality, between which she constantly oscillated. Two features in the medium story struck Jung. First, her ability, when in a mediumistic state, to accomplish performances that were far superior to those she was capable of in her conscious state. Second, the contrast between the personality of Ivens, who was serious, poised, and thoughtful, and the medium's unbalanced habitual personality. Jung concluded that Ivens was none other than the adult personality of the medium that was in the process of elaboration in her unconscious. The patient's psychic growth was impeded by psychological and social obstacles, and the mediumistic career was a means resorted to by the unconscious to overcome these obstacles. So we can see Jung's thoughts and ideas forming around these early concepts that I talked about earlier in the presentation. So the psyche having a telos, a goal, an aim of growth, of evolution and development of the personality, and libido or psychic energy being harnessed either in the form of progression or regression. So it says that Jung's cousin's growth was impeded, progression was stopped, and so the only avenue left was for her libido to be focused internally, to spur some sort of change within the unconscious. So that's what the mediumistic career was about. It was about finding an avenue to allow further development of the personality to take place. And I'll get into more details about that on the next slide. But an interesting side note is that whenever Jung saw her several years later, she had a dressmaker's shop with her sister and actually claimed that she had forgotten everything related to the sessions. So if we put together Jung's ideas and concepts, we can say that Helen was going through a transition into adulthood that was impeded, aka unsuccessful. So something was preventing her from taking a developmental step, from adapting, or from maturing, and because of this, her libido was blocked from progression or adjustment to the external world due to psychological and social reasons. So this stagnation, the stagnation of the personality and of the libido, allowed regression to occur. And then her psychic energy was focused on unconscious content, complexes, and dilemmas, as her psyche was trying to reorganize itself and create avenues for her to develop her personality via her mediumship. So it was the psyche's attempt at trying to find an outlet to work through this process of development that it was in. It was trying to upgrade itself and trying to work things out itself. So being a medium gave her the social standing she was needing and allowed her a platform which to achieve this psychic transformation. So we can say that the clear and black spirits she encountered were archetypal images or forms that allowed her to connect with certain psychic processes that were happening internally. So they were the expression of these psychic processes that were happening internally. The dour and exuberant spirits that represented the two main sides of her personality embodied complexes of her personality and may have been representing the psyche's attempt at integrating both into a more developed personality. So we can see that there is an attempt at renewal and reorganization going on during a process like this. It isn't random. There is something the psyche is attempting to accomplish. So Jung believed that it was reduced ego strength that allows this unconscious material to stream into consciousness, to flood consciousness. And your ego strength is essentially your sense of self. Having a stable sense of self throughout time, a stable knowing of who you are, being able to regulate your emotions, to handle difficulties and challenges in life, to be resilient, to have a sense of belonging or purpose, to have a firm grip on reality. And whenever this loosens or breaks down, this is what allows unconscious content, unconscious energies to stream into consciousness, to overpower the conscious mind. Because typically, your conscious mind, your ego can keep this unconscious content at bay. So if we think of dreaming, for instance, whenever you are sleeping, your conscious mind, your ego is totally relaxed. And it is this that allows your unconscious to completely take over and produce its own reality, to produce the dream. So you can think of psychosis as a type of waking dream where the unconscious is the main force that is cultivating their sense of reality moment to moment. So if we think about this idea of the reduction of ego strength, if we go back to the example we were just getting into regarding Jung's cousin, Helen, and her experience, we talked about there being an impairment or a failure in her ability to adapt to the demands of life for whatever reason that was. Unable to reach the developmental steps she was needing to reach, unable to adjust socially. Because of this, her progression was stopped. When this progression is stopped, her ego strength begins to loosen, to break down. She starts losing stability in her sense of self. And this is what allows the unconscious to take over, to create this other personality of Ivan's, this medium that then began to run the show. So in Jung's approach, whenever someone develops schizophrenia, it is typically initiated at a time when their ego strength becomes reduced because of their inability to adjust to the demands of life. Or maybe someone never developed a stable sense of self, never developed a strong ego. So they are vulnerable from a young age at being possessed by the unconscious. And Jung did think that a person could be and does at times become possessed by unconscious and archetypal energies and complexes. So this idea of having a reduced ego strength is very important when it comes to understanding psychosis. So Jung had this period of his life that was very important in the development of his ideas, where he was confronting and dealing with his unconscious and these unconscious energies. And he called it his confrontation with the unconscious. And I'm going to get into this a little bit just to give you a bit of a further background as to what influenced Jung and how these ideas we've been talking about apply to Jung's own life and what he experienced. And he wrote about this period in his Red Book, which was published after he died. This came out in like 2009, like 50 years after his death, where he was writing down some of these things he was going through. So this period began around 1913. This was a time that Jung describes as having a lot of uncertainty in his life, feeling disoriented, being in a bit of disarray, separating himself from what was familiar, stepping away from professional positions. So this was when he officially broke with Freud. He and Freud were very close for several years. Freud actually thought Jung was going to be his predecessor and inherit his legacy and continue to spread his ideas. But Jung had his own ideas and differed from Freud on several important things, and they could never reconcile this. Freud wouldn't tolerate any sort of dissent within his circle, so Jung knew that he had to break away in order to pursue his own ideas and forge his own path. So Jung stepped down from the International Psychoanalytic Association as well as his university positions. He began to focus on his own private practice and on earlier research that he was interested in. So we can say that Jung's progression, his adaptation to his social circumstances, his social responsibilities, his stability was a bit shaky at this time. And he actually began to have a breakdown, and he began hearing voices, having visions, experiencing vivid imagery, interacting with figures. And Jung actually thought that he was going mad. And this distressed him to the point that he was actually sleeping at one time with a loaded pistol under his mattress. And he actually had thoughts of taking his own life. Then eventually he got to a point where he said, I am going to stop resisting what I'm going through, and I'm going to allow myself to go mad. So he began to embrace what he was experiencing, began to explore it through meditation, through writing about his experiences, through artwork, and through active imagination, which was a process that Jung developed and actually started using with patients in therapy, where the conscious mind is dialoguing with the unconscious via fantasy and imagination. So if you're familiar with IFS at all, internal family systems theory and doing parts work, that is essentially active imagination. So this is how Jung further developed some of his ideas on the psyche, because it stopped being just theoretical. He was already theorizing about this layer of the psyche he called the collective unconscious, and of archetypes, and then he began to experience these things in his own psyche. So this confrontation with his unconscious, he described it as unpopular, ambiguous, and dangerous. It is a voyage of discovery to the other pole of the world. So Jung was very aware on the dangers that come with these types of experiences and attempting to engage with this level of the psyche. For Jung, his family and his practice kept him tethered enough to consensual reality to not be overwhelmed by what he was experiencing, so he wasn't plunged into psychosis. So through a Jungian model, experiences like he was having and psychosis and mystical experiences or religious or spiritual experiences, these all come from the same layer of the psyche, from the collective unconscious. So what differentiates an experience of a mystical or spiritual or enlightening experience from psychosis is your ability to contain the experience, to comprehend it in a meaningful way, and to be able to integrate it into consensual reality. So to be able to walk between the worlds, so to speak, where if you're in psychosis, you are not able to contain the experience. You are overwhelmed by it. So you become lost within this mythopoetic realm of the psyche, the collective unconscious. So this is a piece of artwork by Jung where he is depicting this character, this figure he was engaging with, who he called Philemon. And Philemon was the wise old man archetype within Jung's psyche. So through their dialogues, Philemon would impart insight and wisdom to Jung that helped him further understand himself and the nature of his psyche. So I'll get into a passage on the next slide where Jung talks a little bit about Philemon. I do want to point out you can see some other archetypal images or symbols here as well. Up at the top, you have the two circles that are mandala-like symbols. These represent wholeness or the process of an individuation, the emergence of the self. We have the serpent at the bottom, which the serpent has long been a symbol of the unconscious and primordial or instinctual forces within the psyche. And then we have the depiction of the trees and the forest, which is sort of an expression of the collective unconscious, where Philemon is springing from or where he resides. So this is a passage by Jung in his book Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he is recalling the emergence of Philemon. So he begins, soon after this fantasy, another figure rose out of the unconscious. He developed out of the Elijah figure. I called him Philemon. Philemon was a pagan and brought with him an Egypto-Hellenistic atmosphere with a Gnostic coloration. His figure first appeared to me in the following dream. So I want to stop here a second just to highlight how Philemon presented himself to Jung, because I mentioned earlier in the presentation that archetypes, whenever they manifest, they clothe themselves in a complex, in qualities and characteristics that express something internal to the person. So an archetype takes a form that connects with a psychological resonance within the person. So in Jung's case, he was very interested in the Egyptian and Hellenistic time periods. He actually wanted to be an archaeologist before he went into medicine. He also was interested in and was studying Gnosticism. So how Philemon appeared wasn't random and it wasn't a coincidence. He clothed himself in qualities that meant something to Jung. So he continues with the dream. There was a blue sky like the sea, covered not by clouds but by flat brown clods of earth. It looked as if the clouds were breaking apart and the blue water of the sea were becoming visible between them. But the water was the blue sky. Suddenly there appeared from the right a winged being sailing across the sky. I saw that it was an old man with the horns of a bull. He held a bunch of 4 keys, one of which he clutched as if he were about to open a lock. He had the wings of the kingfisher with its characteristic colors. Philemon and other figures of my fantasies brought home to me the crucial insight that there are things in the psyche which I do not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life. Philemon represented a force which was not myself. In my fantasies, I held conversations with him, and he said things which I had not consciously thought, for I observed clearly that it was he who spoke, not I. He said I treated thoughts as if I generated them myself, but in his view, thoughts were like animals in the forest. It was he who taught me psychic objectivity, the reality of the psyche. Through him the distinction was clarified between myself and the object of my thought. Psychologically, Philemon represented superior insight. He was a mysterious figure to me. At times he seemed to be quite real, as if he were a living personality. I went walking up and down the garden with him, and to me he was what the Indians called a guru. So I wanted to give you some examples from Jung's life, this time period, that highlight experiences he had within his own psyche that led him to refine his ideas about how the psyche operated. And I also wanted to use this to highlight that just because you experience voices or images or figures, it doesn't mean that you are schizophrenic or psychotic. Everyone has the potential to experience these things. There are autonomous forces in everyone's psyche. Everyone inherits the collective unconscious, the mytho-poetic realm that produces these experiences. Everyone can interact with this level of the psyche. It's just that people who develop schizophrenia or psychosis, they cannot contain the material they experience. They cannot assimilate or comprehend their interactions with this realm of the psyche in an adaptive manner that allows them to still function in consensual reality. But just because someone has these experiences like Jung had does not mean that they are psychotic or schizophrenic. The psyche has the natural ability to produce these things within everyone, and the psyche at any given moment in an attempt at adaptation could initiate these experiences. So if people realize that in younger kids it is quite common to have imaginary friends, right? So this shows that we are born with the potential to produce these kinds of things within our psyche. It's just that it comes from the unconscious, and as we get older, the conscious rational mind begins to be more define and take over the personality, which suppresses these unconscious forces. But Jung thought it was important in the process of individuation to work with this layer, this deep layer of the psyche, in order to know yourself more, to integrate undiscovered aspects of yourself, to continue to develop the personality. But Jung also knew that this wasn't for everyone, that there are people who are predisposed for whatever reason, because of reduced ego strength. They cannot contain their experiences with this mythopoetic realm of the psyche. So while we are talking about the experience of hearing and seeing things, I wanted to bring up this concept of Jung's that sometimes hallucinations can be caused by disconnected complexes. So I'm going to read this passage from this article on thisjungianlife.com that talks about this a little bit. Just a side note too, This Jungian Life is a great podcast to check out if you're interested in learning about Jungian theory. But they start by saying, Jung suggested that hearing voices may be caused by disconnected complexes and can either never reintegrate into the psyche's totality or only join together in remission, like a mirror broke into splinters. Jung drew parallels between dream content and hallucinations. For Jung, the feeling tone complex, not the dream, was the royal road to the unconscious. He saw the individual as composed of many autonomous selves, so we cannot assume a unity of consciousness or the primacy of will. Jung said that a person with a strong complex thinks in terms of the complex, dreams with open eyes, and no longer adapts psychologically to the environment. Jung discovered that hallucinations often occurred within the context of significant trauma. He believed that understanding the symbolic message of auditory hallucinations may allow us to piece together the chain of events that led to the emergence of the symptoms. Jung said these forces did not originate in our patients out of nowhere. They are most emphatically not the result of poisoned brain cells, but are normal constituents of our unconscious psyche. They appear in numberless dreams in the same or similar form at a time of life when seemingly nothing was wrong, and they appear in dreams of normal people. So we've already established in Jung's model that we all have autonomous aspects to ourselves, autonomous aspects that live in our psyche, that have their own will, their own needs, their own desires. And this is what a complex is. So if we remember what a complex is, it is formed around core emotional experience. And around this experience, there is a constellation of associated beliefs, feelings, attitudes, images, and memories. And this forms its own little complex entity that is sort of like a subpersonality. Now, sometimes the psyche may be forced into splitting a complex off from the total personality because the complex may be too emotionally charged or overwhelming or painful, so that if it wasn't cut off, it would cause too much maladaptation to the personality. So whenever this happens, whenever a complex is split off, it may reemerge in the context of hallucinations. This is an attempt at some sort of reintegration into the personality. So if we think of an example, let's take someone who was raped at a young age. So around this very traumatic core emotional experience, a complex is formed. There are certain feelings and beliefs and attitudes and memories and images that form around this complex. Now let's say that the person, in order to continue to function, to cope, to prevent their personality from totally fragmenting or from totally breaking down into psychosis, their psyche was forced to cut off this experience, to split off the complex, to pretend like it didn't happen, to suppress it. So there was never any sort of reconciliation with what occurred. There was no coming to terms with the experience. It was just, let's keep our head down and pretend like this didn't happen. So everything we experience stays within us. So this complex doesn't go away. And let's say that it reemerges in the context of auditory hallucinations. The patient starts hearing voices, and these voices are very self-deprecating. They victimize the patient. They tell they take the form of a persecutor. They tell the patient that they're worthless, that they're no good, that they're ugly, that they should just take their own life. Now, this is a symbolic representation of how the patient felt during this experience, during this trauma. They felt victimized, they felt worthless, they felt powerless, and now this complex is expressing itself through the voices. So you have to intervene at the level of the complex, and you need to try to understand the chain of events that led to the emergence of the complex and the symptoms. It isn't enough just to give medications, because while medications may silence the voices for a little bit, it is not going to make the complex go away. It's going to contribute to the complex still being split off and disconnected. So if there is any hope at healing, the source of intervention would be to work with this complex and explore where it came from in an attempt to reintegrate and reorganize the psyche so that it could come to some sort of peace or cooperation with this. So to sum up the basics of psychosis using Jung's model, what is happening during psychosis? So we have to start with the collective unconscious or the objective psyche, because this is the realm of the psyche that is producing the material that a person is engaged with when experiencing an episode of psychosis. This is the level of the psyche a person is immersed in. The archetypal themes and images are coming from this level of the psyche. This is also the level of the psyche that is a source of mystical and spiritual and religious and numinous experiences, according to Jung. And this is a layer that we all inherit. Remember, we all have the potential to experience or access. As Joseph Campbell says, this is a famous quote of his, "The psychotic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims with delight." So this is highlighting the fact that the same layer or level of the psyche is responsible for producing these experiences. So we also just talked about in the last slide about how complexes also, especially disconnected complexes that aren't integrated effectively into the personality, can appear during psychotic states in the form of auditory hallucinations, or perhaps they take the form of a delusional narrative. So a person can also be seized in psychosis by these things, by these autonomous forces. So what's the difference between someone who experiences a psychotic episode and someone who doesn't, who experiences a mystical or spiritual experience, or somewhere in between? Psychosis is a failure to contain and comprehend the content of one's experiences in the context of one's own life. In other words, a person in psychosis is not able to psychologically assimilate or make sense of their experience in a meaningful and manageable way that prevents them from being functionally impaired. So that is the main thing. A person who becomes psychotic is not able to take care of their responsibilities, to maintain relationships. They become impaired in consensual reality because they are not able to contain their experiences in a way that allows them to continue to adapt to the objective world. So, mentioned this several times, that there is a telos to everything the psyche does. So the psyche has a telos, it has an aim, a goal, a direction. Now, the telos of psychosis is an attempt to reorganize the psyche and initiate personality development that has been stagnated or blocked. So the psyche is saying the old personality was untenable and must be updated. And this occurs because progression stops. A person is no longer able to adapt to their environment, to take necessary developmental steps, to mature in ways that the psyche is requiring. So whenever this happens, their psychic energy is directed internally because of psychic regression, which stimulates unconscious content, complexes, and dilemmas which the psyche is attempting to reconcile. Then reduced hegemony or control of the ego allows contact with the objective psyche / collective unconscious, which produces archetypal energy and imagery a person may identify with or become possessed by. So a person may get lost in this mytho-poetic realm during psychosis. And one thing I want to make clear is this understanding is explaining a typical development of schizophrenia, how psychosis develops in schizophrenia. Now, psychosis can be experienced in more acute or immediate ways as well, such as substance use or having some sort of really significant trauma that the psyche just cannot comprehend in the moment. So this may initiate psychosis, but anytime psychosis is initiated, all of these things come into play in some form or another. At the end of the day, everyone is interacting with the objective psyche, and this is what is producing the material that is coming up during psychotic states. Now, what I want to try to do is to bring together the concepts and ideas from Jung's model that I've talked about so far, and to give you an example on how you can apply these things to understand a case of schizophrenia. So I'm going to use a personal example to show how someone using Jung's model would analyze the symptoms and material present during an episode of psychosis in an individual with the schizophrenia syndrome. And the case I'm going to talk about is of a woman I met a couple years ago who gave me permission to make copies of her artwork she made while she was hospitalized. I've removed any identifying information and left out some details to keep things as general as possible, just enough detail I can use to illustrate the main points of Jung's approach. So I'm going to describe how someone may develop a working conceptualization of the symptoms she was experiencing, and then examine the meaning behind the images in her artwork to show that there is incredible depth behind these experiences and they aren't simply nonsensical and random and meaningless. So to give you a background, this is a middle-aged woman. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia for at least a decade when I met her. She was on medications for a decade. She was on disability for her diagnosis. So she was fairly functionally impaired. She was living with an ex-boyfriend at the time. She didn't have any family or friends that she was close to or was supportive. So she really lacked a strong support system. She was pretty isolated, which is why she was living with her ex. She did have some children, but didn't have a close relationship with them. She has a long history of trauma and abuse, specifically sexual trauma and abuse from a young person as well as an adult. She was picked up and brought to the hospital because she was very paranoid and having delusions of persecution. She thought that the mayor of her town, the police, and her ex she was living with were in a cult together and were going to sacrifice her. She was so scared that she was outside her apartment, the apartment, in her truck for over 2 days because she was terrified of getting out and going inside. Once she got to the hospital, she started hearing and communicating with her deceased father and with God. They would give her messages and images that she would draw. So in total, she drew 8 pictures. 2 of them you see here on the screen. She would also sign her name using a specific word that meant God in her native tongue, which was a Native American word. So she was simultaneously separate from and in relationship and communicating with God, and she was also identified with God. So to start with the analysis of her symptoms, one thing we can assume is that in her life, she must have felt very stuck and trapped. She had nowhere else to go. She had no other support. She had little income. She was isolated. The control she felt over her situation and life was probably very limited. And because of this restriction in her independence and her capacity to adapt to life, to enter into a phase of life where she was a functioning, independent adult, to take necessary developmental steps of maturation in her personality, we can conclude that prior to these symptoms, she was probably experiencing a block to her psychic progression. So if we remember what psychic progression is, it is when your psychic energy is focused on meeting the demands and responsibilities of the external world, of functioning in daily life and society. And whenever this stagnates or becomes blocked, it triggers psychic regression, which is when your psychic energy becomes focused internally, flows into the unconscious, stimulates unconscious material, archetypal material, complexes, and these things, in the case of psychosis, then bubble up and manifest in the form of the psychotic symptoms. So in regards to persecutory delusions, which she was having, these are common archetypal themes that manifest around complexes of the individual. So typically the figures of persecution will be someone close to the individual, like family, or a figure with authority and power, or an entity with the power to oppress people, like the CIA or FBI, which are modern cultural symbols for this. Her delusion around the involvement of the mayor and police and this cult pursuing her could represent the influence of an authority complex. The delusion of the involvement of her ex that she was living with could represent a complex around her animus or masculine archetype, and these attitudes could be representative of past experiences of being abused by authority and masculine figures. So because of the emotional intensity of these traumas and the energetic strength of the complex around it, the complex becomes an autonomous force that is projected out and experienced in the world in the form of the delusional material of being stalked and persecuted. It is the emotional experience or energies of her past memories that have taken a current form. So we can also interpret the voices of her deceased father and God as complexes attempting to reintegrate into her personality once she was in a place she felt more safe and stable. So once she got to the hospital and she was more removed from the threat of the perpetrators, the persecutors that she thought were after her. So these voices were voices of comfort and reassurance that she was lacking in reality because of her isolation and lack of support. There was a redemptive and healing quality and attempt to these voices. They could be seen as the psyche's way of attempting to reorganize her personality around healthier relationships with these specific archetypes and complexes. So her maladaptive or neurotic complexes with authority and the masculine were supplanted by more adaptive complexes, so she was not as bothered by her symptoms The figures of her father and God were superordinate and ultimate authority and masculine figures that outranked the previous relationships in their position and influence. Also, the relationship she was having with these voices of her father and God would have held together her personality and provided a sense of self-worth and significance, a compensation or coping mechanism for a previous attitude of inferiority. So the signing of her name in her native tongue, using the native word for God, this identification, this could be seen as an attempted merger with the archetype of the self, the inner God image, the experience of completeness or wholeness which brings healing. There is also a psychic inflation to this as the ego becomes over-identified with or possessed by an archetypal force from the unconscious, which can bring a grandiose element often seen in psychotic states. But this is the psyche trying to bring balance here. There was also a type of trinity that was formed with her, her father, and God, three different identities merged into one. So the Trinity or Trinity figures, this is another archetypal symbol that denotes psychological development. So her Trinity could be a union between the archetypal masculine authority and father energies, which thus far in her life have caused her conflict. Thus her Trinity may be the psyche's attempt at resolving this conflict. And in Jung's observation, trinities developed into quaternities. And a quaternity is a symbol of wholeness, individuation, and the self. So again, signifying a process of psychological development that was attempting to occur. Now I'm going to focus on the two pictures that she drew that I have here on the screen and the images in them. So if we start on the left, we see that at the top, she labels this as a lake of fire, and she has a volcano that's erupting, and then on the left she has red birds flying around, and then on the right you see there is the image of an all-seeing eye. So if we start with the volcano and what this symbol means archetypically and psychologically, I'm going to read a quote. So volcanoes appear in our myths, movies, and dreams. Their awesome destructive power fascinates us and serves as a reminder that we are not in control of nature's primordial forces, offering access to the Earth's molten core. Volcanoes have been believed to be the entryway to the underworld or hell. Volcanoes create new rocks and new landmass. Their mineral-rich output fertilizes the surrounding soil, producing abundant and delicious crops. The volcano serves as a potent image of the unconscious. Unpredictable, sometimes explosive, powered from the depths, but also capable of bestowing its fructifying blessing upon us. So the volcano is a symbol of the eruption of her unconscious that she is experiencing. And while it destroys the original psychic landscape, or attempts to, this destruction brings a fertilization that allows new aspects of the personality to grow out of it. So if we move over to the all-seeing eye, this is also an archetypal symbol, and this represents a higher power or divine presence that watches over and judges the actions of humanity, an omniscient presence or intelligence that provides order. It could symbolically be a representation of the inner intelligence of the psyche, the self, the central archetype of order and meaning, which is attempting to reorganize the personality to bring renewed order to her psychic experience. So remember that Jung viewed the archetypal self as the central manager in the personality. So in the words of Lionel Corbett, the self is an invisible presence that arranges the different aspects of the personality as if in the form of a drama in which each part plays a role. So we can see how these symbols appearing from the unconscious are related to the psychic process she is in and that she is experiencing on a psychic level. The archetype of the self, the conductor of the psyche, represented by the I as overseeing an attempted renewal of the personality, where the old ways of being must be cleared away to make way for the new. And this is what Jung thought the process of psychosis was getting at. So if we move over to the picture on the right, we see figures that she called an army of the dead. And then she wrote Battle of Armageddon and labeled all these different countries that were engaged in this battle. And then at the top, she wrote Al-Malhama Al-Kubra, which I probably pronounced wrong. But this is the Battle of Armageddon in the Islamic tradition. So we can see that there is a big theme of the apocalypse. It's very apocalyptic material that she is depicting in these pictures. So starting with the figures or the army of the dead, these are symbolic images of the forces of the collective unconscious, the objective psyche, which are coming to the surface. So images of the dead have always symbolized the experience of this unconscious realm. The deepest layer of the psyche is represented by the non-living because it is occupied by ancestral relics of the past, inherited forms of psychic experience handed down in the human psyche from antiquity. These forms, these energies, the archetypes are living skeletons in the underworld of the psyche that will always be a part of the psychic constitution of our being. When these unconscious forces overwhelm our conscious experience, such as in psychosis, it is as if an undead army has breached the gates of consciousness. The depiction of armies may also represent the inner conflict that is taking place between unconscious and conscious forces in the psyche. So talking about the overall theme of the apocalypse, this is another archetypal theme that is present in a lot of psychotic material. And if we look at the meaning of the Greek root of the word apocalypse, it means a revealing and uncovering, to take away the covering of something hidden. So in psychological terms, this could mean to strip away false coverings of the ego to reveal painful wisdom of the self. And the four elements of the apocalypse are revelation, judgment, destruction, and renewal. And these are the experiences, the processes going on within the psyche of the individual. The depiction of this theme reflects what is happening internally. To an individual, the archetype of apocalypse represents a process of initiation where the ego is confronted by the self of the objective psyche because its typical way of being in the world and doing things has become too limited and must change. So it is trying to initiate change, to update, to upgrade, to develop the personality. So I'm going to read one last quote. This comes from the Jungian-centered.org, further talking about the archetype of the apocalypse. So whenever we experience the archetype of the apocalypse, we are being asked to recognize our limitations, see our mistakes, feel the pangs of conscious, and come to sense the need to find more authentic and meaningful ways of being. Our world and worldview are shattered, and that is precisely what the self intends. Only by losing our old world and ways of living can we experience the reconstitution or renewal that is at the heart of the archetype of the apocalypse. The self is ever making all things new. It seeks our renewal. It enters consciousness, the world of the ego's making, and shatters its conventions and images decisively so as to permit a new inner reality more appropriate to our soul and the spiritual growth that we have achieved. So this apocalyptic material is symbolizing the need of this patient's psyche to change and update, and thus far in her life there has been a failure to be able to mature and adapt, and the psyche is attempting to initiate this change on its own terms through psychosis. So I also want to again mention, in case you forgot, that archetypal material is filtered through cultural symbols to make itself known. So remember that archetypes are unknowable in their pure form because they are systems of energy. So they manifest in forms that are relatable on an emotional level. So the fact that she used specific names of countries and Al Malhama, Al Kubra, it doesn't mean that these things are to be taken literally. These are symbolic expressions that are relatable to her psyche, to her consciousness, and thus these are the avenues, the archetypal energy that is expressing itself chose in order to create some sort of resonance within her. So I know that was kind of long, but I hope that made some sense, or at least shows you that there is a lot of rich meaning in the material of someone who is going through schizophrenia and psychosis. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Jung's approach to the treatment of schizophrenia. So because the psyche has a telos, an aim, a direction, and Jung saw schizophrenia as an attempt to reorganize the personality, he felt the therapist should be supporting this process to come to a completion. The role of the therapist is to guide and support the patient as they are moving through the intense material from their unconscious, to provide a supportive space and relationship, in hopes that the psyche could heal itself and there would be a return of ego strength and functionality. Although Jung acknowledged that not everyone would successfully achieve this, and there were chronic cases, he saw people achieve recovery and healing. So the main task of the therapist is to guide and support the patient through this process and to help contain the material within the therapeutic relationship. So remember that the patient is becoming overwhelmed and unable to contain and comprehend what they are experiencing. So the therapist must create a therapeutic space and relationship that acts as a container for the patient's psychic material, essentially compensating for the patient's lack of ego strength. So the therapeutic relationship, the container, is to allow them to freely express what they are experiencing on one hand, because if they are alienated and shut down, then they retreat further into themselves, and this becomes a block to working through the material. It can stagnate the process, prevent it from coming to completion. Schizophrenia, these states, are already alienating. The person already feels isolated from the world. They feel exiled from those around them. So the therapist wants to prevent further isolation. They want to lead with empathy and validation of the inner process of the person, of their inner experience, which they don't typically get from mainstream treatment. Their experiences are often disregarded or denied. They are hospitalized and medicated against their will. Their autonomy is stripped away. So this causes them to further feel exiled and isolated from the world around them. The mental health system itself often alienates patients, and the therapist must be a source of connection and an anchor to the social world to try to prevent this. So the therapist also contributes to the container by helping the patient regulate their emotions, by balancing fantasy with a view of reality, by asking questions, getting the patient to become inquisitive, to give different perspectives, and at the end of the day, to form a supportive social relationship, because relationship is necessary to anchor ourselves to a shared reality. We all have to have relationships to be able to connect to a consensual shared reality. So the therapist must also understand the symbolic nature of the psychotic symptoms. They must know their story and history. In psychosis, there is always a germ of personality, hopes and desires, traumas and complexes, and the therapist must get to know these things so that they are able to assign meaning to the symptoms of the patient. They must be able to sit with the patient and have an understanding of what kind of support they need, and they won't know this unless they understand the messaging behind the symptoms. So they need to ask, what do the symptoms say about what the patient is feeling and needing? Where is the patient needing to go? Where are they heading? What are the next steps they are needing to take? Jung also encouraged the use of artwork and writing about the experiences patients were having whenever they were going through these states. So he would use artwork to try to stimulate this material in the unconscious and also contain it. Because if you put the material into words and images and symbols, it concretizes the psychic experience. It puts them in a form that allows the conscious mind to work with them and possibly understand them in a more adaptive fashion. Symbols and images can contain and tame archetypal energies from the unconscious. Creating symbols gives the psyche something it can work with. It gives the psyche something it can potentially reassimilate and reintegrate into the personality. So Jung encouraged the expression of the experience and the emotions of the patient through artwork. So I also want to point out that medications can cause this process to be aborted because they exile the person from themselves, from their emotions, from their experience. It causes the psyche to not be able to work through the material and to come to a completion of the process. It was best to avoid them except in acute situations like reducing terror or if there's the potential for them to hurt themselves or someone else, because the symptoms will always come back at some point because the psyche was not able to achieve the transformation that it was searching for. So I also want to point out that this isn't just a theoretical method or model that Jung came up with. He put this into practice. He treated people with schizophrenia psychotherapeutically at the turn of the 20th century. And this was something that psychiatry at the time didn't think could be done. And again, Jung said that this approach is not successful with everyone for different reasons. This process is not able to come to a completion. There are chronic cases, but he did see people recover, and there's a subset of people that can benefit greatly from this approach. And we will get into that now as I start talking about other treatment modalities and studies done that support Jung's conception and approach towards schizophrenia. So John Weir Perry is one of the most well-known clinicians that implemented Jung's ideas when it came to the treatment of psychosis. Perry was a medical doctor and Jungian analyst who helped implement alternative care facilities for schizophrenia and psychosis. Most notably was Diabasis, which I will get into in a little bit. So Perry furthered Jung's work and believed that psychosis was an attempted healing process. And he thought the role of the clinician was to try to facilitate this healing process along. So Perry thought it was very important to be with the patient and engage curiously and compassionately. He focused on creating a supportive space for the psychotic process to play out. Art supplies were regularly used in sessions to try to stimulate and process the unconscious material that was coming out in psychotic symptoms. And at Diabasis, there was no medication used at all. So before I get into Perry's work and Diabasis, I do want to acknowledge that Perry lost his medical license and was expelled from the Jungian Society for unethical relationships with female patients. So I want to condemn this, obviously, and call out this unethical behavior. But I think we can separate these unethical behaviors he engaged in and was punished for from his clinical contributions to the treatment of psychosis. So Perry saw psychosis as a renewal process, similar to Jung. He said that when a person finds herself in a state of acute distress and circumstances that have assailed her most sensitive realities, her psyche may be stirred into an imperative need to reorganize the self. So, in essence, whenever a person is losing their ability to adapt to life, to their circumstances, whenever their sense of self is beginning to break down, and there's a threat to their psychological existence, the psyche may initiate psychosis as an attempt to try to reorganize, shake things up, bring about a renewal of the personality that allows the person to continue to exist. So the psychologist Paris Williams comments on Perry's conception and approach here. When one develops a self-image and/or world image that are unbearably limiting, the psyche initiates a profound reorganization. During the shift, Perry believed that the deepest levels of the psyche are activated and draw a disproportionate amount of energy in the organismic system, leaving a very low level of energy available to the so-called higher functions, those responsible for relating to the external world. So what he is saying is that whenever one's image of themselves, their image of the world begins to be too limiting, too restricting, impairs their ability to continue existing in a healthy and adaptive way, then this is when the reorganization is initiated by the psyche. And then what Jung called regression, whenever someone's psychic energy begins to be directed inwardly down towards the unconscious, whenever this happens, a disproportionate amount of energy is focused in these deeper realms while this reorganization is attempting to take place. And because of this, there is less psychic energy available for the person to use to be able to adapt to external responsibilities, so to say. So this is why you see people who aren't able to take care of themselves, aren't able to really do their activities of daily living. They may not enough, don't take care of their hygiene, things like this. Paris Williams also continues by commenting on Perry's conception by saying that a person going through this renewal process of psychosis, that their field of awareness is flooded with archetypal affect images or sensory perceptions and emotions that are intricately bound together. And these individuals either identify with the archetypal affect images and believe oneself to be them, such as a second coming of Christ, or they project them out onto the external world, believing themselves to be stalked by CIA agents or malevolent actors. So this is what Jung is saying about how a person's consciousness is flooded with all of this unconscious material that sort of overwhelms them and that a person can become possessed by. So Perry thought that we should be supporting this process in treatment, that we should be supporting the attempted renewal of the personality and sense of self that was attempting to emerge. So here's another quote by Paris Williams talking about this. The best way to support the renewal process is to offer the individual our clarity and caring above all else. Clarity is your ability to be genuinely present with the person and to make the effort to understand and support the person in finding meaning for their experiences. Our job is simply to facilitate this process to the best of our ability. Caring refers to our aspiration to hold the person in all of their experiences, no matter how challenging they may be, with respect and unconditional positive regard. So Perry had a particular set of qualities he embodied while he was working with patients, a specific disposition and ways in which he would relate to the patients, which he thought was crucial, and he taught to the other people who were working with him at Diabasis. So Dr. Michael Cornwall is a psychologist who wrote his dissertation on Perry and his work at Diabasis. And this is a quote by him talking about Perry and the way in which Perry worked with his patients. This way, as developed by Perry, requires the practitioner to be free from any tendency to recoil in fear and judgment or to pathologize the person in need. Practice of this way involves compassion, empathy, and an actual sense of kinship, most often acquired through the practitioner's own experience with visionary or altered states of consciousness. This essentially receptive way is far from passive. It actively creates a safe and sacred space for the client's process while eliciting an increased flow of unconscious content. It invites the expression of both personal and archetypal affects and images. So Perry followed in Jung's footsteps by embodying that empathy and validation of the inner process of the patient were the most important qualities that the clinician or anyone working with the patient could have whenever someone is going through a state of psychosis or an altered state. And because this is not the typical way in which patients are treated by the mental health system, Perry was very critical of the mental health system and thought that we were actually doing more harm than good because we were preventing this regeneration process from following through to completion. So Cornwall also says that Perry became thoroughly convinced that where nature was arranging a reorganization of persons' psyches, our profession was blocking that and instead shunting them mainly into a life of chronic disability. So the treatment at Diabasis was unique, and the foundation of this was the atmosphere that was created. Perry was very intentional on creating an atmosphere that was unlike a traditional hospital or institution where someone would typically be treated for a psychotic episode. He modeled Diabasis after a non-hierarchical community. So he wanted the patient and the staff to be of equal status. He wanted the patient to have more control and influence and power over their treatment process and the space they were in, unlike a traditional hospital or institution where the patient is typically at the bottom of the totem pole, and it is the physician or clinician and staff that supposedly have the insight and knowledge and expertise to direct the patient's treatment, and the staff is essentially there to monitor the patient and ensure that they are doing what they want them to do or tell them to do. Because Perry was a Jungian and believed that there was a purpose to the psychotic episode, there was an attempted renewal of the personality that was occurring. He believed that the real wisdom was coming from inside the psyche of the individual patient. And so treatment should focus around creating an environment that was supportive to the process that the patient was engaged in. To facilitate, hopefully, a renewal of the personality. So the environment was described as light, airy, upbeat, suffused with warm feeling as much like a home as possible, completely non-institutional, so that there'd be no hint of treating mental illness. So Perry didn't want a cold, clinical, isolating environment like a typical hospital where someone feels like a lab rat. He wanted to create more of a home environment where a person would feel comfortable and it would feel warm and inviting and they would be at ease. Diabasis also used a lot of paraprofessionals. So people who didn't have the typical training when it came to standard or conventional mental health care. He was very emphatic that the most effective practitioners would be those not coached and experienced in psychopathology. So he didn't want people who had been conditioned to view mental illness in the standard way. Specifically with psychosis or schizophrenia, he did not want staff who viewed it as a brain disease because this isn't how Perry was approaching it. He worked at Agnews State Hospital, and from his time there, he saw that the experienced psychiatric staff seemed almost overwhelmingly ruled by negative and pathologizing presuppositions. And Perry wanted to prevent Diabasis from being infected with these attitudes, because if you're viewing a psychotic episode as a malfunctioning of the brain of the individual and not as a renewal process, it's going to influence how you treat that person. If you see that person as just needing to be locked up or medicated into a comatose, Perry wanted to protect against attitudes like this for the sake of the patient. So he thought that the most important qualification for a practitioner was an allowing, non-intrusive manner open to unusual states of consciousness. Practitioners needed to be able to respond with appropriate nurturance to regression, and have some acquaintance with inner experience, whether through their own therapy or meditation or creative work, perhaps even their own turmoil or episode, so long as it had been quite resolved by the time of undertaking this work. So Perry specifically wanted staff who were familiar or comfortable with alternative states of consciousness, who had been around them, who had perhaps experienced them themselves, because this would make them more empathetic to the individual who was going through a psychotic state. He wanted people who were able to sit with the patient without being overwhelmed, and to still provide a compassionate and nurturing disposition towards the patient. He wanted people who were familiar with doing inner work, so who were familiar with, you could say, the processes of psychological growth, or the power of the individuals and the individual's psyche to facilitate growth and change. He even had people who had been through psychotic episodes themselves and who had recovered from them, so people who had went through the other side of these experiences and believed that the patients around them could also go through these experiences and come out the other side with growth and change, and for it to be a meaningful experience. This was the atmosphere and the approach of the people at Diabasis. So this is actually a quote from Cornwall's dissertation where he interviewed staff at Diabasis. And so just to give you an idea of what it was like there and how the staff approached the patients when they were going through psychotic episodes, I want to read this quote about what this staff member said. So talking about her experience, she says, "When you've spent 8 hours with an acutely psychotic person, you can't think. You have to operate from your gut. It's hard to describe. It's like kind of an inner strength. In the midst of this chaos, you experience this part that is centered, and you can relate to this other human being's pain on a real deep level. There were also a couple of times of total honesty. At one point, he was really delusional and talking about cutting off his penis, and he was going to do all these things, and I held his hand throughout the whole talk. And at one point, just like a gut response, I said, 'You're really scaring me when you talk that way.' He said, 'Oh, I'm sorry.' He would just clear up because it was relating to a level where I think you're not using your head, but yet you're relating on a very real level, for lack of a better word, so that when you actually make the intervention, which you don't even know is an intervention at the time, it offers some kind of relief for that person. Like a later experience of cradling one of the residents in my arms and giving her a big hug, something where it just comes by intuition. Or like one guy said he was on fire, so I just put water on him. Things like that, where you spontaneously respond from a place that works." Here is another quote from someone who was at Diabasis as well. So they begin by saying, "What was most striking to me with those people who were acutely psychotic when Diabasis was a residence was when they came out of their process. For a week, this man was in his room, had broken out all his windows. There was plastic over the windows. He was nude, and people would go down there and stay with him. He was really psychotic. I would walk in his room, and it was really cold, and you would feel like it was a scene from The Exorcist. Stuff had been thrown through windows, and it would smell in there because he had been living in this acute psychotic space for like a week or something. There were also a few intense interactions with him where he made me out to be Kuan Yin, the Chinese goddess. He was doing all this weird stuff, all these gestures that I was Kuan Yin. That's when I really felt the sense of the people behind me and trust. I could feel at ease enough with the psychosis because I knew they were there. I knew at that particular time that all these people would intervene. So then they were behind me and backed me up. Then one day I came in and he was cleared up and he remembered a lot of it." So I want to contrast how different this is from how a person would be treated at a traditional hospital or institution. This man was allowed for a week or so to live in this psychotic space where he was destroying things. It seems like not taking care of himself very well, immersed in psychotic thoughts and images, and there was no attempt at forcing him to come out of it. He was not held down and medicated. He was allowed to have the space to go through this process with staff watching him, and then he came out of this psychotic process. I'm not sure what happened to this person in the long run, and unfortunately, Perry never published his results officially, although he did talk about them and claim that they were significant. But people who were at Diabasis and saw what happened there did say that there were a significant amount of people who did recover. So what this shows is that even if it's not everyone, there is a group, a subset of people who experience psychotic episodes, and it is like how Jung and Perry conceptualized it as a process that if the psyche is allowed to work through, a person can come out the other side. It may not be everyone, but at least what we know about what happened at Diabasis, that this is true for a portion of people. Okay, so now I want to get into some published material and studies that can be used to give credibility to Jung's concepts and approach to psychosis and schizophrenia. So in order to attempt to validate Jung's approach, we have to look at the natural course of illness when it comes to psychotic or schizophrenia spectrum diagnoses. So what happens to people naturally? We then have to compare that with the course and outcomes of conventional treatment that uses neuroleptics, also known as antipsychotics, because this presumes that the disorder and symptoms are the result of a broken brain or disease state. And if this is true, then the only hope of a person recovering and regaining functionality is via medical or psychopharmacological intervention. So we have two different philosophies. We have Jung's philosophy, which views psychosis as a process initiated by the psyche with a purpose to try to bring about a change, a development, an adaptation, a reorganization of the personality, and that the psyche has the potential to heal itself and bring stability. And then we have the medical approach, which views psychosis as the result of a dysfunctional or disordered or diseased brain that requires medical intervention. So one problem we have when trying to compare the group of the natural course of the illness with the conventional treatment course group is that there is not a whole lot of studies that fairly compare these two groups. The studies we mostly have and that are relied on as the support for the medical model of schizophrenia are short-term studies around 6 to 8 weeks that compare a placebo group with a group given antipsychotics and then measuring their reduction of symptoms. But these don't tell you anything about the long-term results or about the improvements that would occur in the natural course of the illness over time. And then we have studies that are used to justify the long-term use of antipsychotics and further to support the medical model, which are maintenance studies where they take a group of people off antipsychotics and then compare them with a group maintained on the antipsychotics and measure which group has more relapses over a period of time. But again, this does not tell you what would have happened in the natural course of events if those studied were never treated with the conventional interventions. So there are studies and data available from the early and mid 20th century that we could look at, such as the discharge rates of people diagnosed with schizophrenia who were hospitalized in institutions and how they fared, but I'm not going to spend time looking at those because I want to focus on more modern studies. However, if you want to look further into this, I would recommend reading Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker, who documents the history of psychiatric outcomes in the 20th century. And what he finds and documents is that the majority of people diagnosed for a first episode of schizophrenia, so over 50% of people in the mid-20th century. This is before the introduction of Thorazine as a widespread first line of treatment, the first antipsychotic, that over 50% were discharged within a year and able to return to the community with good social outcomes. And many, if not most, of these people did not have relapses and follow-ups of several years. So there is data from early on that suggests that there are people who recover from schizophrenia naturally. And this would support Jung's model that the psyche can heal itself and stabilize itself if it is allowed to go through and complete this process. Okay, so in the 1970s, the National Institute of Mental Health funded a few studies to actually look at and compare what happens with groups who are treated alternatively with minimal antipsychotic treatment versus the traditional standard conventional approach of antipsychotic intervention and maintenance. And one of these projects that was funded was called the Soteria Project. And this was ran by Dr. Lauren Mosher, who was a psychiatrist at the NIMH. And he was actually the head of schizophrenia studies there. And Dr. Mosher did not share the view of some of his peers that schizophrenia was solely a biological disease. He actually thought that a lot of cases of schizophrenia were the result of inner emotional trauma, and that a person could struggle through the content and experience and come out the other side of it healed. And he thought the most important area of intervention was on providing supportive, nurturing, compassionate human relationships. So similar to what was going on at Diabasis with Dr. John Weir Perry. So the Soteria Project went on for 12 years, from 71 to 83, and it compared residential treatment in the community and minimal use of antipsychotic medication with usual hospital treatment for patients with early episode schizophrenia spectrum psychosis. So Soteria was ran out of a large house. It was, like Diabasis, created to have more of a home atmosphere, and there was also paraprofessionals like there was at Diabasis, people who were students who were essentially chosen to be able to relate to the patients and to be able to provide a specific quality of supportive relationship. They were not typically trained clinicians, and they didn't force antipsychotic medication on anyone. They would use it if necessary and if the patient wanted it. And the patients at Soteria were younger people. So we're talking about early young adulthood, people who were going through their first early episode of schizophrenia or psychosis. So there were only 6 patients there at a time. So it was a small residential treatment place. I think over the 12 years, there was like 80 something patients that they treated. Mosher and John Bolla, who helped him publish this study, summarized the results in this quote right here that I have. So completing subjects had significantly better composite outcomes of a medium effect size at Soteria. Completing subjects with schizophrenia exhibited a large effect size benefit with Soteria treatment, particularly in domains of psychopathology, work, and social functioning. Soteria treatment resulted in better 2-year outcomes for patients with newly diagnosed schizophrenia spectrum psychoses, particularly for completing subjects and for those with schizophrenia. In addition, only 58% of Soteria subjects received antipsychotic medications during the follow-up period, and only 19% were continuously maintained on antipsychotic medications. And here's another quote by them summarizing more of their thoughts. Contrary to popular views, minimal use of antipsychotic medications combined with specially designed psychosocial intervention for patients newly identified with schizophrenia spectrum disorder is not harmful, but appears to be advantageous. We think that the balance of risks and benefits associated with the common practice of medicating nearly all early episodes of psychosis should be re-examined. So here is a study, a project that clearly demonstrates there is a subset of people who go through psychotic episodes and who are diagnosed with schizophrenia who are able to be treated without any maintenance of antipsychotic intervention. And here's a quote by Paris Williams further talking about the results of the Soteria Project. Just to highlight this a bit more, in a 2-year longitudinal study, patients who were hospitalized with their first psychotic episode and who volunteered to participate were randomized into 2 groups, with members of one group moving into the Soteria house and members of the other group receiving standard psychiatric treatment. After 2 years, the Soteria residents showed equal or better outcome measurements on all 8 assessment points, having demonstrated the largest gains in the areas of psychopathology, social functioning, and employment. Also, a significantly higher percentage of the Soteria house residents were living independently, had fewer hospital readmissions, and far fewer of them were using psychiatric drugs. So if this approach was this successful and was proven to be superior to the standard treatment of early episode psychosis and schizophrenia, why did this not become more accessible or a part of the regiment of treatment? Why did this essentially just disappear and not many people know about it today? Well, Dr. Mosher was essentially pushed out of the NIMH. During the 80s, there was a big rebranding taking place, a rebranding of mental illness being caused by biological factors. And there was a concerted effort by the APA, the psychiatric industry, the NIMH, the pharmaceutical industry to create this narrative that mental health issues could be pinpointed to be caused by some sort of dysregulation or imbalance in the brain. And it legitimized psychiatrists by having interventions that targeted these supposed imbalances. And obviously, this served the financial interests of pharmaceutical companies. It was a way for the NIMH to get more funding from the government to study these things. It legitimized psychiatry as being a science that focused on clearly definable biological diseases, which separated them from psychologists and therapists in the treatment of mental health issues. So Dr. Mosher's approach in the Soteria house, this data didn't fit into the rebranding and the narrative that was being pushed at the time and is still at the forefront. So real quick, I also wanted to mention another study that took place during the 70s funded by the NIMH. And this one was done by William Carpenter and Thomas McGlashan. And they compared a group treated with standard antipsychotic medication versus a group not treated with drugs. And they found that those treated without drugs were discharged sooner than the drug-treated patients. And only 35% of the non-medicated group relapsed within a year after discharge, compared to 45% of the medicated group. The off-drug patients also suffer less from depression, blunted emotions, and retarded movements. And the patients in this group actually told Carpenter and McGlashan that they found it gratifying and informative to have gone through their psychotic episodes without having their feelings numbed by drugs. And Carpenter and McGlashan actually concluded that the patients who were treated with drugs, because they didn't have the learning experience that was gained from the non-medicated group by going through the psychotic episode, that they were less able, the drug-treated group was less able to cope with subsequent life stressors. So this maps on perfectly with Jung's approach that Psychosis was attempting to bring a development of the personality. And because the people in this study by Carpenter and McGlashan successfully went through this development, they developed in a way that allowed them to subsequently cope with life more effectively and deal with stressors more effectively. Now I want to talk about the Harrow and Job Longitudinal Study, which was funded by the NIMH. So Martin Harrow is deceased now, but was a psychologist at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. And what they did in the study was recruit patients from two different Chicago hospitals, one public and one private. They divided the patients into two different groups, one group with schizophrenia and the other group with a mood disorder, depression or bipolar with psychotic features, or a milder psychotic disorder. And then they periodically followed up with them over the years and assessed how they were doing. So were they recovered? Were they symptomatic? Were they on medications? Were they in treatment? How were they doing socially? Were they working? Things like this. So they followed up at 2 years, 4.5 years, 7.5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and then 20 years. So here is a quote from a 2012 article, which is when they published their 20-year results, and this explains the study. A total of 139 early young psychotic patients from the Chicago follow-up study, including 70 patients with schizophrenia syndromes and 69 with mood disorders, were assessed prospectively at the acute phase and then followed up 6 times over the next 20 years. Patients were assessed with standardized instruments for major symptoms, psychosocial functioning, personality, attitudinal variables, neurocognition, and treatment. So if we were looking to validate Jung's theory on psychosis and schizophrenia, what would we expect to see? We would expect to see a group of the patients that were recovered, that were not symptomatic, that were adapted socially, that were not on medications, that were not in treatment, and that had a return of a strong, stable sense of self, a return of ego strength. This would be evidence that even though they were diagnosed with schizophrenia, they didn't have a brain disease or a broken, dysfunctional brain. Because if they did, they would have to be maintained on medication in order to be able to function. So if there is a group of patients that are functioning well, are not symptomatic, this is evidence that they moved through their psychosis, they transcended their symptoms, and that the process of psychosis came to a completion. So this is a description of what they found, also published in their 2012 article. At each follow-up, 30 to 40% of schizophrenia patients were no longer on antipsychotics. Starting at the 4.5-year follow-ups and continuing thereafter, schizophrenia patients not on antipsychotics for prolonged periods were significantly less likely to be psychotic and experienced more periods of recovery. They also had more favorable risk and protective factors. Schizophrenia patients off antipsychotics for prolonged periods did not relapse more frequently. So another thing I want to point out is that these patients had these favorable outcomes also had favorable risk and protective factors. So this is also aligned with Jung's thoughts that not everyone is able to bring this process of psychosis to a completion, and a lot of it has to do with your initial strength of your sense of self and also social support and things like that. So this is a table showing the global adjustment of the two different groups of patients over 15 years of follow-up. So on the left, we have the schizophrenia patients, and on the right, the other psychotic patients. I'm just going to stick with the schizophrenia patients, even though the results of both groups are similar. So they used the global functioning and adjustment scale, which goes from 1 to 8. The higher the number, the worse off the patients are. So the closer the number is to 8, the worse their functioning is. So what we see is that at every year of follow-up, the patients not on any medications are doing significantly better than the patients on antipsychotics. And in particular, at the 4.5-year mark, there is significant improvement. So from the 2-year mark to the 4.5-year mark, there's something going on in these patients that is contributing to the improvement that we're seeing here. And if we're using a Jungian lens to interpret this, if we're going to use his model, we would say, well, in order to move through schizophrenia or psychosis, to bring the process to completion, there must be successful development, adaptation, growth of the personality, because the process was initiated to bring this development on. So perhaps during this period is when this is occurring for most of these people. This is when the upgrading of their character, the growth, the psychological growth is setting in, the concretization of the completion of their psychotic process, an upgraded, stable sense of self and view of the world. So what we see is that it takes time for this to occur. So if you give people time to move through this process, there are going to be some people who do this successfully and who recover. Now, on the flip side, we could say that the individuals maintained on antipsychotics, that the antipsychotics were blocking them from completing this process. They were separating them from their emotions and from their symptoms, so they were blocked from moving through the psychic processes that would have been necessary to achieve the adaptation of their personality. So the antipsychotics caused an abortion of the process, caused the individuals to stagnate, and their symptoms would have kept coming back because they never achieved the growth of the personality that the psychosis was trying to achieve. Now, to be fair, we could also say perhaps that maybe the individuals on the medications had a worse prognosis and were worse off from the beginning. And Martin Harrow thought that they had a weaker sense of self, reduced ego strength. So this would have perhaps prevented them from successfully dealing with and handling and integrating their symptoms and experience. This is also plausible. Just to give you some more data on this as well. So at the 15-year follow-up, 40% of those off drugs were in recovery, and more than half were working, and only 28% suffered from psychotic symptoms. In contrast, of those taking medications, only 5% were in recovery, and 64% were actively psychotic. So this is a graphic depicting the data from the table we just looked at in the previous slide on the global functioning assessment of the different groups of patients on and off medications. So the groups labeled manic depressive on and off meds. In this graphic, these are the same people that were labeled other psychotic patients in the previous table. So where I want to start at is at the 2-year point, where we can see the manic depressive group on medications and the schizophrenia group off medications are essentially doing the same. They're functioning at the same level. And then there's this 2.5-year period in between follow-ups where there's a significant degree of separation between them, and there's a significant degree of improvement in the schizophrenia group off meds. And we also see this in the manic depressive group that are off meds. And then if we look at the two groups that are maintained on medications, from the 2-year point on, there is no improvement. There's a bottoming out, a stagnation of their functioning. But if we just want to compare the manic depressive group on meds and the schizophrenia group off meds, this is very interesting, because if we are looking at this through the lens of conventional psychiatric wisdom and understanding of mental diagnoses, these results don't make sense. It doesn't make sense that there is this large of a difference between the functioning in these two groups. So obviously, psychiatry looks at mental health diagnoses through the lens of biological imbalances, physiological abnormalities, some sort of dysregulation in the brain or neurochemical imbalance that's occurring. That's the root of the mental health issue. So we would expect through traditional psychiatry that the group labeled manic depressive on medications that are receiving treatment addressing the so-called abnormalities going on in their biology would be doing better than the group of schizophrenia patients not receiving any sort of standard treatment to address the so-called imbalances in their brain, especially when you consider schizophrenia is considered a brain disease that gets worse over time. And as a whole, a group of people diagnosed with schizophrenia should be functioning worse because schizophrenia is considered one of the most severe diagnoses you can receive when it comes to functional impairment. So you wouldn't expect a group of people diagnosed with schizophrenia to be functioning better off medications than a group diagnosed with a mood disorder or a milder psychotic disorder receiving treatment, at least not using standard psychiatric understanding. We can make sense of these results, though, if we use Jung's model and views on the psyche, the role of symptoms and mental illness, and what the purpose of these things are, because the psyche has a telos, an aim, a direction, a goal of growth and development and evolution of the personality. Symptoms have meaning, and mental health issues manifest when the psyche is attempting to spur some sort of psychological growth to occur in the personality. And so we would assume that both of these groups off medications improved because they actualized the psychological growth that their psyches were requiring for the development of the personality. And because of this, their symptoms improved, their adaptation to the world, their functionality improved, or in other words, progression took hold again. Whereas the groups on medication, for whatever reasons, their ability to achieve the psychological development that their psyches were asking of them was impeded. It was blocked. It never occurred. And there could be many reasons for this. Potentially these people as a whole had less ability to cope and deal with stress. They had less internal resources, inner resiliency, weaker ego strength, a weaker sense of self. They could have had more traumatic upbringings that impeded their ability to develop a strong ego or sense of self. Potentially they also had less supportive social relationships. There could be a bunch of reasons, as well as the medications themselves could have acted as some sort of impediment to their development, especially when we focused on antipsychotics, because we know they shrink the frontal lobes, cause cognitive impairment, separate or detach people from their emotions. So in the attempt to suppress the symptoms, there are side effects. And in Jung's model, if you are simply suppressing the symptoms, you are going to be stuck in what he called neurotic suffering. So if we remember the difference between natural and neurotic suffering is an intrinsic part of life that the psyche uses to catalyze growth of some sort or adaptation. And neurotic suffering is a result of what happens whenever natural suffering is avoided or necessary developmental steps to the psychological maturity and adaptation of the individual are impaired, impeded, not confronted or avoided. So it could be the difference in what we see between these two groups if we are interpreting things through a Jungian model. Okay, so one more graph from the study. What you're looking at is a comparison of the outcomes for the two different schizophrenia groups. So the group that went off antipsychotics and the group that stayed on antipsychotics. So starting from the left, we see that 44% of the group that went off their medication achieved recovery. So they achieved remission of their symptoms and had good social functioning, whereas only 5% of the group that stayed on antipsychotics achieved this recovery. And then we see 40% of the off antipsychotic group had a fair or okay outcome, whereas 46% of the on antipsychotic group had a fair or okay outcome, and then only 16% of the schizophrenia group that went off antipsychotics had a poor outcome, whereas 49%, basically half of the group that stayed on antipsychotics, had a poor outcome. So consider what I've shared about Jung's approach and his model of psychosis and schizophrenia and come to your own conclusion about these results. But what should be clear is that there is a subset of people who experience psychosis, who are diagnosed with schizophrenia, who move through these symptoms and achieve recovery, who achieve pre-morbid functioning, who do not need lifelong medication management, and it is a disservice to treat them as if they have a brain disease. They would be much better served by approaching their treatment from a Jungian view, that what they're experiencing is a process, and if this process can be brought to completion, then they can recover and return to functioning at a high level. And the reason that clinicians don't have this view and don't see these patients recover is because the patients that do recover leave. They leave the system, and so you aren't going to see them. So in 1969, the World Health Organization launched an effort to study schizophrenia outcomes in 9 different countries. It was called the International Pilot Study of Schizophrenia, IPSS. They looked at 3 developing countries, Colombia, India, and Nigeria, and 6 developed ones, Denmark, Taiwan, the United Kingdom, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia. The outcomes were assessed by looking at the percentage of time with psychosis symptoms, the type of remission after each episode, and the degree of social impairment. And they rated the patients on a scale of 1, which went best, to 7, worst. At the 5-year follow-up, India had the most success, with 42% of cases reporting best outcomes, followed by Nigeria with 33% of cases. By contrast, the developed countries had poor showings. Best outcomes were seen in only 17% of cases in the United States and in fewer than 10% in the other developed nations. So obviously, the developing countries had a different approach that was resulting in better outcomes for their schizophrenia patients. So what was this? In 1978, the WHO launched a 10-country study, this time primarily enrolling people suffering from a first episode of schizophrenia. And this is a passage from Robert Whitaker's book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, talking about the results of the study. At the end of 2 years, nearly 2/3 of the patients in the developing countries had good outcomes. Slightly more than 1/3 had become chronically ill. In the rich countries, only 37% of the patients had good outcomes and 59% became chronically ill. The findings of a better outcome of patients in developing countries was confirmed, the WHO scientists wrote. Being in a developed country was a strong predictor of not attaining a complete remission. So there was something going on in developed countries that was preventing complete remission for most patients. Putting together what we've talked about Jung's ideas regarding psychosis and it being a process initiated by the psyche to bring about some upgrade, change of the personality, we can guess that this wasn't occurring in the developed countries, but was occurring in the developing countries for some reason. So the WHO investigators tracked antipsychotic usage in the second study, thinking that maybe the patients were doing better in the developing countries because they more reliably took their medications, but they did not find this. They actually found that only 16% of the patients in the poor countries were regularly maintained on antipsychotics versus 61% of the patients in the rich countries. Moreover, in Agra, India, where patients arguably fared the best, only 3% of the patients were kept on an antipsychotic. Medication usage was highest in Moscow, and that city had the highest percentage of patients who were constantly ill. And then in 1997, WHO researchers interviewed patients from these first two studies. So it was 15 to 25 years after the initial studies. And they found that these better outcomes were maintained. They held up for the general clinical state, the symptomatology, the disability, and the social functioning. So the people in the developing countries were better on all of these measures. And actually, they found that 53% of the schizophrenia patients were simply never psychotic anymore, and 73% were employed. So again, here are results that do not align with modern conventional psychiatric wisdom and understanding in the treatment of schizophrenia, but we can align these results with Jung's model of the psyche and schizophrenia, and that if the reorganization of the personality takes place, the psychological growth that the psyche is requiring comes to fruition, the process comes to a completion, and individuals can recover. So the NIMH funded another study in the 70s. This one ran by Maurice Rappaport at the University of California in San Francisco at the Agnews State Hospital. And the results of this study are akin to what we've seen in the previous ones we've just looked at, that individuals experiencing psychosis or diagnosed with schizophrenia seem to end up doing better in the long run if there is little or no antipsychotic exposure, which aligns with Jung's approach that there is a redemptive quality to psychosis, and if that is allowed to play itself out and come to a completion, that a return to stability and healing can occur in individuals. So in this study, Rappaport randomized 80 young newly diagnosed male schizophrenic patients into drug and non-drug groups. And then there was a 3-year follow-up period. So there ended up being 4 different groups. There was a group randomized to placebo in the hospital that stayed off antipsychotics. Then there was a group given antipsychotics in the hospital that then went off of the antipsychotics when they got out. There was a group given the placebo in the hospital that then went on antipsychotics during the follow-up period. And then there was a group given the antipsychotic in the hospital that stayed on antipsychotics throughout the follow-up period. So if we look at this graph and the different measures on these 4 different groups, we can clearly see that the group that did by far the best was the group given a placebo in the hospital and who stayed off of antipsychotics during the follow-up period. So these people never had any exposure to antipsychotic medications. They had the lowest severity of illness. They had the greatest improvement and change in their clinical status, and they had the lowest rates of rehospitalizations. And then the group that did the second best were the people given an antipsychotic in the hospital that then went off them when they got out during the follow-up period. They had the second best severity of illness, the second best rate of positive change, and the second lowest rehospitalization rates. And then the 2 groups that did the worst were the group given a placebo who then went on antipsychotics, and then the group given an antipsychotic who stayed on antipsychotics during the follow-up period. So there's quite a drastic change specifically between the group never exposed to antipsychotics and the group that had the maximum exposure to antipsychotics. You can see the rehospitalization rate is just significantly worse in the antipsychotic group than the placebo group. So what we see here is what we've seen in John Weir Perry's work at Diabasis, in Lauren Mosher's work at Soteria House, and what Jung described in his work with schizophrenia patients in the early 20th century, that there is a subset of people that can go through psychosis as a process, and that this process can be allowed to come to a completion, and that these people do not need to be maintained on antipsychotics, and that a return to healthy functioning can return to these people, which brings up the possibility that what's going on here is more than just some sort of brain dysfunction, that there is an adaptive attempt going on in the psychosis, and that there is a purpose to what the psyche is trying to do, which should be a part of the consideration when treating these people. So the last study I'm going to talk about comes from the open dialogue approach, which is used in parts of Finland when responding to early episodes of psychosis. To give you a little bit of a background on this, in the 70s and 80s, there was a group of clinicians in Finland that started treating psychotic patients with what they called a need-adapted treatment approach. So this was a very case-specific and conservative approach to using medications. They wanted to keep people off drugs. If possible, they wanted to keep them out of the hospital. Really, the core of the treatment was more of a social approach. The driving intention was to help the patient reintegrate back into society. And what these clinicians thought was that a lot of the patients had trouble or weren't ready to be adults yet. So they wanted to help them with their development so that they could fit into society. They developed psychosis teams of 2 to 3 people, which could have been psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, social workers, and they would meet with the patient and the patient's family and do group family therapy. And this was a big part of treatment. And they wanted the patient to collaborate and make decisions when it came to their treatment. They wanted to strengthen the patient's grip on life. A lot of the conversations that they had in these sessions may have been focused on past successes and achievements of the patient to try to reestablish their connection with society. They wanted to help the patient construct a new self-narrative where they could imagine themselves in the future being integrated back into society instead of being isolated. They really wanted to keep the patient from being isolated, which is sort of the opposite of what we do in the West. Our treatment approach is much more alienating and isolating. So this approach to treatment makes sense if we think about Jung's concepts of progression and regression and on how psychosis comes to manifest. So if we remember what progression is, it's when our psychic energy is focused on meeting the demands of the external world, on adapting to our social environment, and whenever this is blocked or becomes stagnant, or we're unable to take a developmental step such as becoming an adult, then progression stops and regression kicks in, and then our psychic energy is focused internally towards the unconscious, which stimulates unconscious material and content, which then comes out in the form of psychotic symptoms. So essentially, in this treatment approach, they want to help kickstart progression again so that the patient's psychic energy is focused more on being able to meet the demands of the external world, which in turn helps the psychotic symptoms abate and dissipate. So out of this approach in the 90s came an offshoot called open dialogue therapy, which essentially has the same core basic principles to the treatment. There is a psychosis team of 2 or 3 people, and whenever someone is going through an episode, they will call, and this team is supposed to show up within, I think, like 24 hours and meet with the patient and with the family and have an open dialogue discussion about what's occurring. They try not to use any medications, especially in the first few meetings. They may prescribe some medications if the patient isn't sleeping and if they're not like taking care of their activities of daily living, like bathing regularly, then they may give them like a low dose of something. But essentially, they want to help the patient strengthen their grip on life, to reestablish social connections, and to keep them out of the hospital. So if we look at what's on the screen here, this is results from a 5-year study where they used open dialogue therapy. And this particular area in Finland is called Western Lapland, and this is where it's used most heavily. So we can see here, let me pull up the Laser pointer. Okay. So 67% of these patients, out of 75 patients that were experiencing psychosis, 67% of them were never exposed to an antipsychotic. 33% had occasional use during 5 years, so that they were given antipsychotics at some point, and only 20% of them had ongoing use of antipsychotics after 5 years. So we can see 67% of patients treated with this approach did not relapse during 5 years, the same amount that was not given an antipsychotic. 79% of them were asymptomatic at the 5-year follow-up, so they didn't have any symptoms of psychosis. And the major thing is that 73% of these patients were working or in school at the end of 5 years, only 7% unemployed, and only 20% were on disability. So these are much better numbers than we would see here in the West. And I should also say that at the time Robert Whitaker published his book Anatomy of an Epidemic, in Western Lapland, there was a 90% drop since the early 1980s in new cases of schizophrenia. So his book was published around 2010, and this period of 20, 30 years, there was a 90% drop in new cases of schizophrenia. So the important thing here that we learn is that how we respond to the early episodes of psychosis or schizophrenia are very important to the progression of the illness and if people recover and get better. Now, we do see from these results that 20%, around 20% have a chronic course. So perhaps this is pretty accurate when it comes to overall diagnoses of schizophrenia, but there is a large proportion will either recover or that will recover enough to be able to function semi-well in society. And this is not the case today, at least in Western society, under the care of conventional psychiatry. We see much more impairment in these individuals and much less recovery. So I would use these results to argue that at least a significant portion of people who experience psychosis, who are diagnosed with schizophrenia, don't have a brain disease, and the psychosis and these symptoms are closer to what Jung described in his model than the medical model explains it by. So if you've made it this far, you've made it to the end. I know that this has been a lengthy presentation, but I wanted to give a thorough explanation of Jung's ideas. They're very complex, so I wanted to give them adequate attention that they deserve. But I hope that this has convinced you there is more to what is going on during psychosis and schizophrenia than it only being a disorder of the brain, at least for a significant subset of people. And I hope that I have showed you that, again, a subset of people can and do recover from this, and that we should expand how we approach the treatment of these states if we really want to help people achieve recovery and healing.